give a little bit of an overview of the session today. This session was really kind of put together because we were hearing from groups that really wanted advice on how they should constitute and whether or not they should constitute as well. So it was a lot of different inquiries started to kind of come through, and over the last sort of like year or so, we've had many more as well. And we thought it would be a good idea to bring a few different groups together and have a conversation, share some tips, share some experiences around governance, around how the groups are constituted, but also how they run as well. So we were asking this question, is your group confused or undecided about how to constitute? Or is the way that your group is set up hampering you from moving forward? If you have any questions about what organization or form to set up or models of governance, hopefully this Skillshare will explore some of those different possibilities and the practical steps to bring that legal structure into alignment with your group's needs and ambitions. So Transition Together is a project funded by the National Lottery that supports transition groups across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. You can be in touch with us through a variety of different platforms. I'm going to post them on the chat now, including our website, Twitter, and Facebook. I have some amazing blogs that are produced and go out across the network. They're definitely worth diving into. So have a little look at that when you can. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Danny and I'm the training and support lead. One of the things that Transition Together is trying to do is to offer trainings and skill shares and opportunities to learn from each other that will really like upskill us as individuals within our groups, but also hopefully really filter through to the workings of the groups themselves so that we can make our transition groups more effective. So we're all often working in our silos, and it can feel sometimes like we're quite alone. Sometimes we get drop off in our groups and we can feel like we're shouldering quite a lot of responsibility. And that can have all sorts of impacts on our kind of well-being, the productivity of the groups, and also, how effective we feel and how effective the groups are. So looking at different aspects like governance is really important to support the network, to be able to grow, to be able to evolve, and also to reflect and question, well, have we actually got the right model for who we have right now? Are we going in the direction that, we could potentially grow into something else? So these are important little points in time where we can really just take stock and hopefully use some of the information from others to maybe miss out some of the difficulty that they experienced along the way. That's certainly the intention of these skill shares anyway. But before we get stuck in, a little bit of housekeeping. It'd be wonderful if when you're not speaking, if you could please put your mics on mute. Especially for this first part with our speakers, it helps everybody to hear. There'll be lots of chances to ask questions and to share your thoughts, so do let us know. We'll be taking questions as we go in the chat or afterwards, after all the speakers have spoken. With the exception of our first speaker, who unfortunately can't stay till the end. So Pauline is going to open us up shortly. I'll introduce her in a minute. And we'll take questions for Pauline if we have any, because unfortunately Pauline cannot stay for the rest of the session. But for our other two speakers, we will bunch those questions together at the end. As I mentioned, we'll be recording today's session for those that couldn't make it. It is so nice to see your faces. If you are feeling confident enough to have your camera on. If not, that's totally fine. Please do leave it off. That's not a problem at all. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker this evening. We've got Pauline Cory from Transition Town Worthing CIC. She's a director since the CIC was established 10 years ago. Sorry, I think that's correct, but I might be corrected in a second. 7, is it? Yeah, 7 years ago. There you go. And has been involved for 10 years. I think that was right. But anyway, the point is that Pauline has got a lot of experience with Transition Town Worthing, and she joined in 2010. And by that August was on the steering group and helped run a variety of projects and events for Transition Town Worthing over the past 13 years, including community climate conference, several eco open houses events, and a big annual eco festival in their town. She is the project lead for the Community Repair Cafe and 2 community allotments, and initiated the Sustainable Working Map. And as we will hear, it's a result of many years of work and local collaboration and networking. But Pauline is here to speak a little bit more about the way that the transition group is constituted and how that came to be a CIC. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you, Pauline. Thanks very much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry I can only be with you for a short time this evening. As I said to Ros earlier on, I've got long COVID, and I run out of energy dramatically at this time of day. So if I'm not in bed by about 8:15, then I'm absolutely useless tomorrow. So please forgive me for not being around for the whole session. Also forgive me for working from notes, because long COVID sort of sabotaged my brain a bit. So just sort of have it in front of me so I don't forget what I'm going to say. But I think what I wanted to say is making the decision to apply to become a CIC, CIO, or charity depends on how ambitious you are and what you want and need to achieve. I think right from the start in 2009, we had a constitution, a bank account, elected officers, properly minuted steering group meetings, and our annual accounts were audited. So we had a good base from which to work. All we did by becoming a CIC was to formalise those existing structures. We were running for 8 years before we became a CIC, and we've been one for almost 7 years now, since 2017, as Danny said. So we've had a good opportunity to compare what it's like with and without being a formally constituted legal entity. We wasted a lot of time and energy debating whether we should become a CIC, as some of our steering group feared change at the time and wanted to stay exactly as we were. Personally, I was a bit ambivalent about whether we did or whether we didn't, but in the end, I could see that in order to move forward with bolder projects and events, we had no choice but to go this route. We started missing out on some golden opportunities that we were really ready for. Plus, we were advised that because we were holding quite a large amount of public money, we were obliged to become legally constituted. So we just bit the bullet and got on with it. For those who at the time feared change, naturally, all we are now obliged to do that we weren't doing before is to write an official annual report. But apart from that, nothing much has changed, just apart from our legal status. I can't think, I was really kind of thinking hard about this earlier on, and I can't actually think of any disadvantages that we've come across to us taking this step. Apart from, the process that you have to go through, which actually is, in the end, is no bad thing, because it makes you examine everything that you're doing. I can't think of any disadvantages that we have found becoming a CIC. Without a doubt, CIC status for us has brought greater credibility and respect. We've been listened to, taken much more seriously, and included in a wide range of projects, meetings, events, and partnerships since we became a CIC. It seems to reassure people. They don't feel they're taking a risk to include us, and it's certainly opened a lot more doors for us, including funding bids. Our members' liability, including the directors, under our CIC is £1 if everything goes horribly wrong, which of course we hope it doesn't, but as everybody is now protected legally, a lot of our members were a lot happy with that. In fact, some people didn't want to become members until we were a CIC. So obviously those people, they joined, became members once we were. But it depends on, what kind of process you want to go through and whether you feel you're ready to take that step or whether, in fact, you need to take that step for whatever reason. There's an awful lot of paperwork involved, but far more paperwork involved in becoming a charity. We spent 2 years working on the whole process. Firstly, we applied for CIO status and it was refused. We appealed, but they weren't having any of it and said no. What we were doing was not everything that we were doing was of charitable objectives, even though we felt that we were. But I think the CIO was, as I said to Ros earlier on, CIO was a very kind of new status at that time, and I think we were a bit like guinea pigs, and so I know certainly organisations that have gone for CIO status since that time and got it are doing very similar work to us. So I think we were just very unfortunate that that's how it was at the time. So we went for the easier option at the time, which is a CIC. And that did take a few months as there was a lot of paperwork involved, but we were very fortunate to have a director who was perfectly happy to wade his way through all the requirements and come up with something we were all in agreement with. I was very grateful to him. We all were. It's not everybody's forte, and it's certainly not mine. I'm much more hands-on, practical and solutions-based, and so organising events and project is much more my thing than a mountain of paperwork, although it's a very necessary thing. Being a public limited company means you're more transparent. People can easily see who you are and what you do by going onto company records. So if you Google Transition Town Worthing, you'll see our website comes up, and underneath that you'll see that our CIC registration is under that. If you wanted to have a look at what we've done, you could just click on filing history and go to page 2, and then you'll find a 71-page certificate of incorporation. You might find it helpful if you decide to go this route to see some of the wording, especially the memorandum of association, which starts on page 39. We've had other groups ring us to say, can we crib what you've done? Can we have a look at and see what you've done, and can we use some of that wording? So that has been helpful, I think, to some organisations who want to go that route. We spent about 18 months getting all our structures in place around about the time that we were registering, working our way through all the documentation that would be helpful to any of our members or indeed any other community groups doing similar things. And all that information is on our website under resources and then documents and then TTW policies and documents. Not only has this made it easier for all of us, but it's very useful for any of our members who'd like to organise an event, for example. I think they found it really helpful in doing that. And it's also helpful when writing funding bids for partnership working or working with your local council, where this kind of information is required. It's like the permaculture 80-20 principle. If you've studied permaculture or know anything about it, get your foundations and structures in place, and then it makes life a lot easier later on. I think that's probably really all I need to cover right now. Obviously, happy to answer questions. And I think Mark was going to cover the more kind of structural stuff later.
Thanks so much, Pauline. I really, really appreciate that. And, you know, when you were talking about the difficulty that you faced and all of the hoops that you had to jump through, I think that that's something that a lot of people fear, really, when it comes to thinking about kind of registration process. Perhaps they won't have somebody to hold their hand in the way that you had somebody in your group to really kind of like beat that drum and do all of the fine-tooth comb nitty-gritty work. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about that part of the journey, what it was like for you personally, how you navigated it? Because although perhaps, like you said, it wasn't you doing the bulk of the work there, you were a director to be at the time and obviously very heavily involved. And so you would have been in those discussions. I think it would be really great to get a reflection on, well, how does one stay, up to date and involved and contribute in some way, even if the expertise is not really kind of at the forefront of the skill set?
Yeah, I'm to be honest, it's really difficult for me to answer that question because I was so incredibly ill at the time and was barely able to function on any level. So I just had to rely on the others uh, really investigating it all and looking at all the different options. I mean, we had already I was involved in looking at the CIO stuff and kind of, answered all the questions that I needed to answer to send that off. But because at the time my illness just completely wiped me out and I couldn't even read a very simple page of text at the time because it had affected my central nervous system, my illness. So I really did have to leave it to the others to just filter it all out and then just explain stuff to me in very simple terms about what the next steps were. And to be perfectly honest, because I had COVID 4 years ago and I've had long COVID brain ever since. All of that, because it was 7 years ago that we went through all of this, I'm very, very foggy about the actual process that we went through. I just remember James, who did all the paperwork, just literally he just sat down and went through everything that was required and just created a document from that, then passed it round to all of us. Everybody read it. I did read it naturally. By then I was feeling a lot better, so I was able to comprehend a large part of it. And it all seemed to be fine. I mean, a lot of it is just based on everything that we were doing before, as I said. So the actual process that we went to, I think we just literally we spoke to we engaged a pro bono solicitor, and he went through everything with James and kind of that got filtered out to the rest of us. But that was a really useful process, I think, at the time, because he was able to help us find our way through all of the different types of being constituted that were available at that particular time, and explained all the pros and cons of each of those things, and listened to what we were saying and what we wanted, and said, well, actually, I think, go for CIO first. If you don't get that, then go for CIC. So I think the solicitor, kind of helped us find our way through it at the time. So if you've got anybody like that who does charity, who kind of not understands charity law and is happy to do some pro bono work for you, I think that's a really, really useful way forward. The other thing is that the organisation that suggested that we needed to become a legally constituted group, they ran sessions for groups to come along and listen to kind of expert speakers. They still do, about going through this process. So I think 2 or 3 of the directors went along to those sessions and again filtered out all of that information and listened to what they said. And that, I think there were documents that they provided as well that just kind of took you through the basic information, so that it wasn't so just a mountain of information that you couldn't get your head around.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's
absolutely.
helpful or not, Danny. Sorry.
That's very helpful. And what you're talking about, I guess relates. Unfortunately, Hilary Sudbury from Corp Assist can't be here this evening. but that's an organization that offers similar support for the Southwest. And I know that Mark, who will be with us shortly, his organization also does that kind of work, co-op culture. So it's really great to know that, you know, you draw on those resources of those whose, you know, bread and butter it is really. And also I just want to just say what just fantastic that you managed to stick through it all. You've been on quite a journey. Your story is quite remarkable, and you know here you are, you know, still at the coal face, so to speak, at the fore of things. And you know,
I'm very stubborn. I
yeah,
don't like
well,
being
sometimes we
beaten
have to
by
be, right?
anything.
But I think that I wanted to highlight the fact that you know, really almost that forced that level of trust, which is something that we really try to cultivate within transition groups. And it doesn't come easily, trust. And sometimes you just have to trust in certain situations. And sometimes, you know, it's something it's earned a little bit more slowly. But it's something that without which groups won't function very well at all. So to be able to have the trust in others to do different elements of the work is a really, really important part. Before you go, Pauline, I've got one more question and there's one in the chat. So I'll try and keep it super, super brief. Um, I would just like to know a little bit about how you function now as a CIC, because there you go, you've got you're incorporated now, you've got the kind of CIC regulator that you obviously do your reports to. You said it's not too different to how you were before,
Yeah.
and that's really great to know that it hasn't, you know, been too much of a burden. But what about the governance within within the transition group itself? How do you organize? How do you make decisions? And how does that correlate to the fact that a CIC needs directors? For example, is it just the directors that make decisions? Is it something that you know, open up to others when perhaps it's not necessarily a legal concern? Could you just speak very, very briefly to that? And then I'll come to, I think it's Erica's comment in the chat.
Um, I think decision making fundamentally it's done by the directors, but obviously if there are any major decisions, then we refer that back to the members. Um, Either by having, depends how huge a decision it is. But you know, we would have a meeting with members if it was a really, really big decision that we needed to make. And I'm sorry, I couldn't hold in my head what you said just before that.
No, that's it really. It's about that decision making. It's about how, yeah, how you structure those kind of I guess power within an organization, because you've got directors now, haven't you? And so there
Yeah,
is
we've
the
got 7
yeah.
directors, and then we have about 50, we call them paid up members, although they don't pay any money, committed members. And then we have our newsletter goes out to nearly 1,000 subscribers. So we have a lot of followers who get involved and do all sorts of things with us. But yeah, the uh, sorry, I've forgotten what I was saying. This is what happens
No,
to
no,
me.
that's
My
fine.
brain is
You were
useless.
talking about the different sort of levels of membership, the directors, the
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and
So the members, you know, if we need to make any kind of major decisions and we need the members to vote on that, then that's either done by email, or not everybody's on email, unfortunately. So we can't always do it like that. So we would speak to somebody who wasn't on email, or we would call a meeting. And it's good fun to have meetings anyway. We just have a shared supper and everybody gets around a table and yeah, but that doesn't, we don't seem to have needed to really do very much of that. I think once we got everything in place and everything was much more solid, and you know, we had a lot of structures in place, but I think once we became a CIC, it just seems to, I'm sure it's not like this for everybody, but it just seems to smooth the way. It just seems to kind of run itself now.
mhm.
uh, that's what I was saying, sort of 80-20 principle. You know, you put in a lot of work at the beginning and then it just all kind of ticks along nicely, you know.
That's really, really good to hear. And thank you for coming tonight and for sharing that story. I know that Erica is interested in different aspects that Perhaps we can save that question for Mark because it goes into some of the kind of real detail. Um, unless I pass over to Erica, if there's anything very specific that you'd like to ask Pauline, Erica, are you happy with holding that question?
It's just about whether, Pauline, you have still would wish to have some charitable pathway, whether you have a charitable aspect to your work beyond the community interest. Because some organisations apparently can have a charitable arm, some structures. I'm not sure if a CIC is one. But thank you very much for everything you've said. It's been really helpful.
Okay, thank you. I mean, no, yes, I'm sure Mark can answer the I know charities can have a CIC arm kind of thing, but I don't know about the other way around, but I'm sure Mark can speak to that. Can you still fundraise even though you're technically a company? Yes. Looking at membership. The actual kind of what we call paid up members are just members of the public. But certainly partners, we have loads of different partners. I mean, we're in the middle of trying to form a food partnership with loads. I mean, we had a meeting last week and about 50 different people there from all sorts of different organizations, council, anybody, people who run food banks, and anybody to do with the whole kind of local food. We had a farmer there. So all the different aspects of sustainable food in our area. That's something that we're trying to do with multi-stakeholder partners. So, and the council, we work very, very closely with the council, and we have done for years. So,
yeah, and as you were saying in your introduction, it was that CIC status that really enabled that credibility to be able to kind of work with those multi-stakeholders. Just as a kind of as a note to finish, you said that it enabled you to secure kind of like larger funds, larger grants. But for those groups that kind of like might see this video now and are thinking about whether or not they should move forward and incorporate into something like a CIC, what sort of level of funding has it enabled you to access? Could you just kind of name a couple of projects or grants that you wouldn't have necessarily got if you weren't a CIC?
Yeah, I think with our eco open houses events, I think before we were a CIC, we'd either have to get somebody else to get the funding for us, which happened for the first two eco open house events. But then we didn't, we were only talking about a relatively small amount of money, just hundreds or a few thousand. Whereas once we became a CIC, we were putting in funding bids for like 10, 15, 20,000 pounds and getting them to run those events. Well, they're huge events. And we put on a really big climate conference in Worthing in 2020, partnering one of the local community groups, but partnering the council to put on that conference, and the council gave us the funding for that. And I don't think that would have happened if we weren't a CIC. I just noticed the difference in the way that they responded to what we did. It was like they started to take us seriously, because I don't know, I suppose they thought, well, we're taking ourselves more seriously, so they needed to. But one of the comments from one of the local councillors was at this big climate conference, so there were 300 delegates there, was he said, oh, what a wonderful job you've done. So you're not just a load of tree huggers then, are you? And, this looks like you're all doing a really wonderful job. And I felt like slapping him, but I kind of understood that he finally saw that we were not just a load of tree huggers, that we were actually really serious about what we were doing, and that we had some kind of credibility. We knew what we were talking about. So I think, it just seems to have worked that way for us. It might not for everybody, but it certainly did for us.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Really appreciate you being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Um, have a lovely restful evening. I know
Thank
that
you.
you have to go now, but we really appreciate your story, and so good to have hung on for that one as well, because it's how we're seen in the eyes of others sometimes that determine
Yes.
how successful we can be. And it's an interesting tension about not wanting to be, performative, or, have to do things to please others, but actually strategically, sometimes it can really, really be a great benefit. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for that
Thank you.
story.
And thank you for recording this, because I'm looking forward to tomorrow, or whenever the video comes out, to hearing what Ros has to say, and Mark and everybody else. So thank you very much for doing that. Very grateful. And I'm really sorry I need to go.
No problem at all. Go well.
Okay. Thank you. Good night,
Good
everybody.
night. Bye-bye for now. So that's Pauline Cory from Transition Town Worthing CIC. And really, really wonderful to hear about the shift that's been able to happen for her. But now we're going to turn our attention to a different transition group, Transition Leytonstone. And we're really lucky to have Ros Bedlow here. Ros has a background in teaching and training, permaculture, future studies, and domestic energy efficiency, and has lived in Japan for 10 years, which is what got her used to decision making by consensus and prepared for life in the transition bubble. We're really, really grateful to have Ros with us this evening. And hopefully, what we'll hear from Ros now is a little bit about the experience of not being a kind of a constituted organization, but finding other ways to navigate this kind of the world of transition, and finding ways to get things done without that step. And really excited to hear from you, Ros. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, my story is a bit different. So we are not a CIC or a charity. Transition Leytonstone started actually at the same time as Worthing in 2009. And for a while, we were just a group of sort of 8 or 10 people with no formal structure at all. We referred to ourselves, I think, as a community group. And in the early days, we did apply for small pots of funding, or medium-sized pots of funding up to about £5,000 using other organisations' bank accounts. And that was fine for a while. Then in 2011, we started looking for land to create a community garden. And we identified a piece of land, but were told by the council we could have the use of this land if we got funding to start the garden. So this was a specific Olympic related, because we're quite near to Stratford, Olympic related pot of funding. So it was for £11,000, which is quite a lot. But we actually went for the simplest structure that would enable us to do that. It's a terrible mouthful. It's an unincorporated not-for-profit association. So it doesn't roll off the tongue. So all we needed at that point was a constitution and a bank account. So we set up a bank account. I think we stole a constitution from another organisation and adapted it to our own needs, which is something we've done quite a lot of over the years, but that's fine. So the constitution still stands. We do refer to it, we use it. And occasionally we have to submit it when we apply for funding. We also have some formal policies. So we've got an environmental policy, which is a bit daft for a transition group, but there you go. Health and safety and equal opportunities. But then again, we've developed those policies when somebody's asked us to. So all the time we've been quite sort of reactive, I suppose. And yeah, we have done the barest minimum. But so far, so good. So just a little bit more about our structure. So sometimes when we apply for funding, we need to name a chair, a secretary, and a treasurer. Of course, that's easily done. We just name people who nominally fill those roles. In practice, only the treasurer does what it said on the tin, so to speak. The chair or facilitator of the meeting actually rotates, so different people get a chance to facilitate. We encourage that, and different people take the minutes. If letters or emails need to be written, the person who is best placed to do that will write it. So often it will be related to a specific project. So we don't have a secretary who does all the secretarial work. So other roles are mainly related to specific projects, such as the coordinator of the community fridge, for example. Another role is that of newsletter writer, and then we have a small team of IT support people. I think there may be some change in the air, though, which is one reason why I was really interested in coming on this Skillshare this evening. We've just had an AGM and 2 new people have joined our steering group. So I think it'll be time to revisit our roles and responsibilities and possibly our structure. Although, as I say, we've always been quite reactive, and so far we haven't felt the need to change our structure. But if we do in the future, then it would be good to have the information ready to do that. So we have a steering group of 12 people, just increased from 10. We meet once a month, and whoever's facilitating that month sends out an email about a week before the meeting, asking for the project leads to send a brief report. So this is how we document and keep a track of everything that's going on in all the projects. And we ask everybody on the steering group to suggest agenda items. So we do things collaboratively as far as possible. So Pauline talked about members. We don't see ourselves as being a membership organisation. We have, as I say, a steering group of 12. We have somewhere between 600 and 700 on our newsletter mailing list, and probably getting on for 1,000 followers on Facebook. But we don't, strictly speaking, talk of members. So our main projects at the moment, the ongoing ones, so as opposed to one-off events, are a community garden, community fridge, a library for change, we call it, and a green directory. Sometimes we set up subgroups, for example, to prepare for an event, and then they meet separately so that our steering group meetings don't go on forever. Something else you asked about, Danny, was decision-making processes. Well, that's something we've never made a decision about. We don't have one. So far, it's been okay without an official declaration of this is how we make decisions. So it's up to the facilitator to make sure everyone has the opportunity to voice their opinion in a steering group meeting. And then somehow we just seem to agree. So it is by consensus. And I think this is where trust comes in, because Danny, you referred to trust, and it really is very, very important. And we seem to have done fairly well on that so far. What else? Our treasurer gives an update on the finances about once a quarter and reports at the AGM. But we don't have to produce an official annual report or get our accounts audited or anything like that. So really our structure and our constitution have served us well so far, and the fact that we're not for profit has enabled us to apply for funding such as we've needed so far. I think the biggest pot of funding was that 11,000. We've just got another pot of 7,000, so it doesn't restrict us all that much at the moment. And I'd really like to find out what other structures would enable us to do that we can't do now. One thing we're not sure about is whether we can employ people under the structure we have at the moment. So I'd quite like to hear about that. So I think, sorry, that was probably terribly quick, but I think that's about it, basically. So we are the simplest of simple, structures. But so far, so good.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Roz. And I imagine that there are many transition groups across the nations that have a very similar structure. There are far fewer that are registered as a CIC or a charity or a community benefit society. So, I think that whether they're a constituted group, an association which is not for profit like yourselves, or whether or not they're unconstituted, it really is a kind of very, very kind of popular form. And I think that it is because of that simplicity that you spoke about. It was great to get that insight into, how you organize and, the internal governance of Transition Leytonstone. For example, the subgroups that you set up for specific projects. And to hear that when you come together, you haven't really had any difficulties when it comes to decision making. And I guess there's a sort of question that I have in my mind, which, it's a rhetorical one, really, because we won't be able to answer it here. It's, will that get, more difficult, or perhaps would tensions be higher if there were higher stakes, such as, a greater amount of money, or, like you're talking about, potentially employing somebody, might that then kind of cause, with the extra responsibilities, a little bit more sort of care required to be able to sort of like navigate that. So some really interesting questions arising from that, and wonderful to hear how smooth it is and how productive it is, and with the scale of things that you were talking about, in terms of, whether you're looking at economically, grants that you've received, or whether or not the projects that you're delivering on the ground, or the number of people that you reach or working with, locally, it's not too dissimilar to Transition Worthing CIC. So, you can see how there is a bit of scale change, but it's in the same ballpark still. And I imagine that whereas Pauline was talking about kind of doing that 80-20 work, getting the structure right, it probably has set them up for growth. And with your new members joining, and that question arising as to whether or not, there needs to be kind of changes. If you are going to go down a particular pathway to expand or run multiple projects, and there will be more finances, maybe that's a bridge that you'll come to cross. But we'll hear a little bit more about some of those structures shortly from Mark. I just want to kind of throw this open in case anybody has a very specific question about what you've said just now before we move on. And if not, no worries. We'll go on to the next speaker. No, great. So we'll hold it there. Thank you so much, Ros. Brilliant to hear from you, and brilliant to hear about all the great work that Transition Leytonstone is doing. So our next speaker, who has taken time out of this beautiful sunny evening that we're all experiencing, is Mark Simmonds from Co-op Culture. Mark is an experienced cooperative and community entrepreneur, delivering advice and support around all aspects of cooperative and other social enterprise development, management, and governance. So Mark is a founder member of the Fox and Goose Cooperative Pub, Pennine Community Power, Platform 6 Development Cooperative, and Heppenstall Community Assets. And so Mark is a former member of the UK Cooperative Governance Expert Reference Panel. That's a mouthful, but I can imagine what it does. Mark, maybe you can tell us more in a moment. And Mark is kind of has particular expertise in designing legal and organizational structures, particularly when it comes to participatory planning with large groups, business planning, governance, health checks, and the like. So it's really, really fantastic that you're able to join us tonight, Mark. And hopefully you can give us a run through of the different types of organizational structures that might be available or are available and might be desirable for transition groups across the nations. And and maybe kind of going through some of the pros and cons of those. But without further ado, Mark, welcome. Over to you.
Caught a good bit of what's gone on before, and while I've been listening to that, I've been basically pulling bits of other presentations that speak to what's done. So I think I can actually maybe stimulate a bit more discussion, but answer a lot of the questions that have come up from what we've heard so far. So I'll just rattle through a couple of slides from different presentations, and then I'll probably just get to the point where I'll give you an overview of these are all the different legal forms that are available in the UK, which I can show you lots of different examples of, but I'll probably stop at that point, and maybe if we need to drill down into actual examples, we can do, and see how we're doing for time. So I'm just going to share my screen. And first of all, we will go to this one. So this is just a Miro board. Okay, are you looking at 3 circles with a ship underneath? Okay, so this is just speaking to that idea of any organization, irrespective of what it was. So if we look at this one on the left here, this circle with these people inside it, that is any organization. And even if you don't think of yourself as having members, you have got members. The people who are inside the organization and aren't the outside world are the members. And if the law ever looks at you, it will look at them as the members. And even if you've only, for example, we heard, I think it was transition Leytonstone, you've only got 12 people who make the decisions. You are the 12 members. Okay. Typically, as organizations grow, they elect a smaller body, a committee, a steering group, a board, trustees, to basically be more agile at making decision making. So if you're up to about sort of 15, 20 people, it's difficult to make decisions in a meeting of that size. So they tend to elect a smaller board, management committee, who meet regularly and make those decisions. And these larger members might only meet once a year at an annual general meeting. And the metaphor I like to use here is that these people here are like the people on the bridge of the ship. They actually have, so once you create this relationship where you elect a smaller body of people, they actually have legal responsibilities in law, irrespective of how you're created. And they're mainly there to look at the strategy. So for the ship, they're sort of plotting the journey. They're looking out for icebergs. And everyone else is basically doing stuff on the ship, like, making the beds, cooking the dinners, all that sort of thing, stoking the boilers. But these people here have a sort of responsibility to sort of look into the outside world. Is the organization on track with regards to its mission, etc.? In small organizations, these people tend to be the same as these people. So that sounds like transition Leytonstone, for example, where these people are acting in the role as directors, but they're also members. And we simply call that a collective. So you might have heard people refer to things as collectives over the years. That's all a collective means, is the members are the same people as the directors or the committee or whatever you want to call them. So a lot of people use lots of different names for these things, but they are all the same relationships and they all have the same duties and responsibilities. And then this third one is just to illustrate the fact that you might have different classes of membership within an organization. So, for instance, you might have workers and customers, and you might, on the board that they then elect, you might ensure that there's always one customer or always one worker or one particular class of member is always in a majority, for example. Right, I'm just going to attempt to stop share before I switch to another screen. Just heads up that the last week, this was causing my Zoom to crash. If it does, I will drop out and come back in very quickly. But touch wood, we should be all right. Having said that, it's not letting me do it. So, so I'm just going to leave the meeting and come back in, Danny, but I'll be very quick.
Not a problem. Yeah. Technology, it supposedly rules the world, but certainly rules us from time to time. Hopefully Mark won't be too long. Here we go. There you go, Mark. Should be working for you now. Oh, Mark, you're on mute. Do you just unmute for us?
Yeah, so that's the difference between board governance and collective governance. So every organisation has members, and most organisations, when they get to a certain size, will elect a smaller group of people to be that management committee, etc. And that's irrespective of whether you're incorporated or not, or what your legal form is, with a couple of exceptions that we won't get into today. So I'm just going to share my screen into just the second, but this is the final one. So if it does kick me out, that's it. Can you see some jam jars? Great. So this is a separate distinction I'm making between legal form and organizational type. So legal form is how the law regards you. What's the sort of like the empty jam jar, the vessel that you're putting your organization inside. So we've heard about community interest company earlier on. We've heard about unincorporated association, company, society, partnership. They are all legal forms, how the law regards you. Okay. And for many of those, there is a set of legislation behind it. So there's company law, there's society law, there's partnership law, etc. And then we've got the jam in the jam jar, which is stuff that we are more interested in. So whether you're a cooperative, whether you're a social enterprise, whether you're a community business, whether you're not for profit, that's been mentioned. A lot of UK organisations are now looking at becoming B Corps. Whether you're a land trust, even whether you're a transition town organisation or a transition enterprise, these are just organisational types. There's no law, there's no register for any of these. For instance, McDonald's could call itself a social enterprise, and there's no one to tell it no. Okay. So you've got your vehicle, your jam jar that you put the organization inside, and then what your jam jar is and how you run things inside is pretty much up to you. And then if we think of, well, how does that relate to charity? Charity is basically a tax status, and it's a bit like a fair trade mark on the side of the jar. So many legal forms can be charities, some can't. In order to be a charity, you have to be established for charitable purposes. So there's 13 charitable heads, relief of poverty, education, improvement of the efficiency of the police and the armed forces is a charitable purpose. So long as you're doing one of those things and your turnover is over £5,000, then you can be a charity. So you're then subject to charity law jurisdiction, which controls what you do. There are tax benefits. So you're exempt from corporation tax and you're exempt from 80% of business rates. You do have restrictions on your use of your assets. So you can only apply your assets for your charitable purpose. And there are restrictions on payments to people involved in the government. So in most organizations, you can actually pay those people on that committee or that board of directors. If you're a charity, it's really difficult. There are exceptions, and you need to get the Charity Commission to approve those exceptions. So, for instance, Rob Hopkins is a trustee of the Transition Network, but he's also employed by it. But that's a peculiar situation around Rob Hopkins that the Charity Commission has approved. Okay, so that's charity. So empty jam jar, that's your legal form. The jam in your jam jar is your organizational type, the sort of thing that you actually boast about or talk about and put on grant funding things. And then charity is just whether by virtue of what you do and how you're organized, you're able to get this extra charitable tax status. I'm just going to skip a slide and now look at incorporation. So we've heard about CICs, which are incorporated things, and we've heard about unincorporated not-for-profit, so unincorporated association. And so these people on the left here this group of, say, farmers who've just come together to do something, they can just start doing it. They can get a bank account, they can apply for funding, etc. They can go for grant funding. And these people would either be, if they are not with a view to making profit, they are an unincorporated association. So even by just starting doing it, not getting any pieces of paper, not registering with anyone, not having a constitution, the law already has an opinion what they are. So if they're not for profit, they're an unincorporated association. If they're for profit, they are a partnership. And then they would be subject to partnership law. There's no unincorporated association act, but there is a partnership act. So these people, if they started trading together and just started doing it, there would be a duty on them to submit partnership accounts to HMRC and Companies House. However, if they decide that actually, for whatever reason, and we're going to look at those reasons, they need to create a new legal person. So imagine that this is, transition town Leytonstone, where I am in West Yorkshire, and we decide that we need something a bit more formal as a legal structure. That process of actually sticking ourselves inside a jam jar is known as incorporation, and it creates a new person in law. Okay, so a CIC is a legal person, a company is a legal person, etc. Okay, so that's incorporation. So what's wrong with being unincorporated? So as Transition Leytonstone are at the moment, so they're a group of people who come together for a common purpose without a view to making profit. And as they find, it's free, they don't have to pay anyone to be that. It's really easy. There's very little regulation. You can still get a bank account, but you're going to have to write a constitution, and the bank will want to see that. And you can get grant funding. And again, that grant funder is going to want to see the constitution as well. So that's fine. And but the downside of it, this speaks to that thing. How about employing people? The downside of it is there is no separate legal identity. There is no person separate to these 5 people here. So it cannot enter into contracts. One of these people or several of them jointly has to enter into a contract. So for instance, many working men's clubs and social clubs were set up as a thing called a friendly society years ago, which was another form of unincorporated legal form. There was no separate legal person. Every time they changed their committee, someone different had to sign the electricity bill, for example, because there wasn't that legal structure around the working men's club, which is why many of those friendly societies have now converted to a thing called a cooperative society, which is an incorporated legal form. So you can't enter into contracts, and that also speaks to the employment thing. So employing someone is a contract, even if you don't actually then do your duty of providing them with an employment contract. So if you're the person who says, congratulations, Fred, you've got the job working with Transition Leytonstone to deliver this project, and I said that, legally, I'm the employer. And if that relationship goes wrong, I am the person who would end up in industrial tribunal. And the real downside of that is that bottom line there, unlimited personal liability. So I could lose everything I own if it all goes horribly wrong for this organization. So the sort of the take-home message from that is, if all you're doing is having meetings, getting a bit of grant funding, running some events, that's fine. As soon as you need to employ people, as soon as you need to own any significant assets like a building or land, as soon as you're doing a significant amount of trade, that if it goes wrong, someone might be coming for their money, you need to consider incorporation to protect the members, because they're of that unlimited personal liability. And it's what's known as joint and several liability. So if I'm the person who wants to get money out of this organization, I can go for all of them, or I can just go to one of them for all of it. So rather than me suing 5 people, I'm just going to sue the one with the most assets, really, and get it all out of them and let them sort it out amongst themselves. So it can get very messy with unincorporated associations if you're doing any significant amount of risky activity. So that's what's wrong. The pros and cons of it. So the flip side of what's wrong is what's good about it. Once we put our 5 farmers inside our jam jar, they now have limited liability. Okay, so they can't lose everything unless they do something really, really outrageous. So the limit of their liability is generally either a guarantee. So in a company limited by guarantee, you normally guarantee £1 towards the debts of the organization. So the most you can lose is £1. Or if it's something where people have invested shares in it, the most they can lose is the value of their shares. Okay, so they're now safe inside their jam jar. There are now more options for finance. So for now, they can issue shares to raise money. They can now enter into contracts. So they can now employ people in the name of the organization rather than individual members. And if it goes wrong, it's the organization that ends up in industrial tribunal. And if the tribunal awards against them, the members are protected by the limited liability from that award. I mean, it might sink the organization, but people aren't going to lose their houses. And you can now own stuff collectively. So, for instance, local to me, about 10 years ago, I helped incorporate an allotment society. So they were just renting land off a landowner. All they were doing was collecting rent from the members, paying rent to the landlord. They could still get insurance. They could still get a bank account. That was fine. Okay. There wasn't really any risk to the members. But the landowner said, do you want to buy the land? So then they needed to create something, and they just created a simple company limited by guarantee to be the thing that owned the land. They got grant funding in order to buy the land, and they're still happily ticking on down the years now. Okay, so that's the good side of it. Now they've created this legal person. The downside of it is it costs them money to do it, and it also there's an annual fee. So, for instance, companies is now about £38 a year just to tell them that you still exist. You're going to have to submit accounts both to Companies House and to HMRC if you're a company, and there is more regulation. So now there's a Companies Act or a Cooperative and Community Benefit Societies Act or a Limited Liability Partnership Act, etc., depending on what you've incorporated at. One thing I should say, I'll just nip back to this. What's wrong with being this organization could still be a charity. So you can be an unincorporated charity. Okay. So those are the pros and cons of incorporation. And and then finally, and I'll stop at this point and we'll have a chat, but I can dig deeper into this. This is just a sort of like a family tree of the legal forms available in the UK. So we've got all of this sort of left-hand side, all these company legal forms. So the company legal forms sort of emerged out of the very early days of corporations, when the only way you could set up a corporation was to initially by royal charter. So quite a few universities were set up by royal charter. And then, things like the vehicles that we use, like the East India Company and things like that, which are around exploitation and colonization, they were ways for people to pool their capital to then go out and exploit the world, but again, set up by charter. Then it became possible that Parliament to set things up. So, for instance, many of the canals were set up as share-based companies to raise the money to build canals and railways. One of the reasons that the canals basically weren't all filled in the 1940s and 50s was because it required a separate act of Parliament in order to close them, because they were set up by charter by Parliament. Whereas if they'd just been the companies we know today, they'd probably all be gone by now. But into our modern era, we are now, as normal people, don't have to go to the royal family or to Parliament in order to set up companies. We can just go to Companies House and do it. There's 3 main sorts of them. We've got companies limited by guarantee. we've got companies limited by shares, and we've got public limited companies. So these two on the left here are sort of like human-sized organizations, and PLCs are big, ugly organizations that can trade on the stock exchange. So they're a way for large people, for large organizations to put large amounts of capital into organizations. So things like British Telecom and British Petroleum are PLCs. So we don't see them in our world very often. I think Cafe Direct and for some reason, the Centre for Alternative Technology set up a PLC to build a water-powered lift at its site in Machynlleth. Both of those have now gone bust, those PLCs. So we're mainly dealing with companies limited by guarantee on there. You can think of them as your simplest jam jar. They just give you an empty jam jar that's going to protect your members. It doesn't really allow you to do anything else. You can't issue shares, etc. Companies limited by shares are traditionally for-profit enterprises, again, where people pool their capital with a view to making profit. So certainly in the voluntary community and social enterprise sector and the sort of transition sector, we're rarely seeing company limited by guarantees. We're seeing lots of companies limited by guarantees. And then in 2005, the then Labour government decided we needed another legal form for social enterprise. And they created a thing called community interest companies, which was just an overlay on the existing company structures. So you can set up as a KIC limited by guarantee, KIC limited by shares, or a community interest PLC. The main reason they wanted to do this is they wanted to create things that operated for good, for community purpose, that didn't have to be charities. So they were doing good, but they weren't forced down the charity route. And also that they would allow people to invest in them and even make a small amount of profit out of them to do the good thing. So the idea was there would be lots of community interest PLCs. I think there's been one in, 19 years. There would be lots of KICs limited by shares. Again, hardly any. And that not that many KICs limited by guarantee, whereas in practice, 99% of them are KICs limited by guarantee, because people are treating it more as a brand, where they could just as easily be the company limited by guarantee underneath. But CIC sounds nice, so they've just gone for the CIC. Okay. I mean, it doesn't cause them huge amounts of problems, but it's completely, it's us, Yeah, it's the different way around to where it was anticipated to work. So that's the company side. So your normal companies and then the KIC overlays. Meanwhile, on the other side here, we've got registered societies, which emerged from that friendly society, the cooperative movement, mutual insurance and things like that. They tend to be more democratic. They tend to be large member-based organizations, and they're a lot. Their philanthropy is based in them, into them as well. There's two main sorts of registered society since the 2014 Act, which renamed them. There's cooperative societies, which are societies that operate for the benefit of the members. So most working men's clubs are now cooperative societies. The High Street Co-op is a cooperative society owned by its shopper members. You may have heard of SUMA, which is a large equal pay worker co-op up here in West Yorkshire, but there's also Green City in Scotland, Essential in Bristol, Unicorn in Manchester, and Infinity in Brighton. They are all using the cooperative society legal form because they exist for the benefit of, in their case, their worker members. And then this other one, which was created later on, the Community Benefit Society, exists for the benefit of a community. So it's often used for community-owned pubs, community-owned shops. We've even got community-owned farms and forests, and I can show you some examples of those if you're interested. And then the other interesting thing about that is some community benefits societies can also get that charity, and those charitable benefits. But weirdly, they have to apply to HM Revenue and Customs in order to do it rather than the Charity Commission. So it's quite a convoluted landscape. And then just to fill the little bit in the middle, We have this thing called limited liability partnerships, which were designed for lawyers and doctors. So again, they're like those partnership people come together with a view to making profit. They just want a jam jar to keep them safe inside. So it's just a safe version of a partnership. And then in 2011, because the only way to create an incorporated charity up to then was to set up a company with Companies House, then go to the Charity Commission and get charitable status. They created a thing called a charitable incorporated organisation where you could go to the Charity Commission and do it all in one. So a charitable incorporated organisation is the only example of a jam jar that has to have that charity sticker on the side. And I'll stop there for the moment, and I'll try and stop sharing. It may kick me out again. If it does, I will reappear. Oh no, it's let me do it that time.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's absolutely fascinating and really succinct and articulate as well. I can imagine that you've been doing that for quite a while. And, you know, really interesting to hear about kind of how these kind of legal forms came into being as well. I didn't realize, you know, half of the journeys that they've been on. What we have is a situation within the kind of transition movement within the UK, whereby, you know, most of them are unincorporated groups or kind of sort of similar structures to Transition Leytonstone, or CICs, like Transition Town Worthing CIC, which interestingly, as we heard earlier from Pauline, applied to be a CIO but got rejected, and that's why they went down the CIC route, or community benefit societies, CBSs, which obviously, as you just mentioned, are there to kind of benefit the community. One thing that I'd like to kind of name is around community assets. It feels like that is a really kind of important advantage of being a CIC. The fact that if you are registered as a KIC, then if your organization took on an asset, that asset would be held in an asset lock so that it could only ever be transferred for community benefit if you sold it or if you moved it on, as far as I understood. So it'd be nice to hear whether that's true or not, and something on that, if that's okay, Mark. And then also, very briefly, because we've only got 12 minutes, and I'd definitely like to get to a couple of questions too. So, you know, as super brief. Something on the kind of the differences between community benefit societies and CICs in terms of how they actually function, you know, the kind of the regulation that's involved, or, you know, what it might permit you or not permit you to do. What's the kind of reality on the kind of ground from that governance structure?
So is that something you want me to pick up?
If it's okay, if you could just very briefly.
I can, yeah. So I was just trying to recommend some banks. So I'll just say it about banks.
Please do. That was a question from Erica, who's also looking for a bank account for a group which now has a constitution, but is unincorporated and is finding it difficult.
It's getting really hard to set up bank accounts now. So the banks are just not interested, a lot of them. It used to be quite easy. So I would normally say Cooperative Bank or Unity Trust. Triodos were brilliant, but they're not accepting new applications. I have heard some people have managed to use the new Metro Bank. So there's a lot of these challenger banks, but they tend to only understand companies. So if you're not a company, people really struggle. But Cooperative Bank might take a little bit long, but they're quite good. In terms of asset locks, so asset locks do not prevent the sale of assets. What they do is they hardwire the use of those assets for community benefit. So, for instance, if you own a building, so if you're a charity, a CIC, or a community benefit society, then you have a statutory asset lock. Other organisations sort of write their own in and live by them. But that asset lock means that if it doesn't stop you selling the building, if you own a building, because you might want to sell that building and buy an even better building in order to achieve the charitable purpose. It does mean that you can't sell things cheap as well. So, for example, I worked with a CIC that had a load of tools that they wanted to give away, and their asset lock prevented them giving them away without the permission of the community interest company regulator. So sometimes this sort of asset lock can actually work against you. And yeah, one of the things I'm picking up from what you're saying is that lots of groups of transition groups are unincorporated associations, and some are CICs, and some will be other things as well. Many groups start as an unincorporated association, and I almost think of it, it's like an insect lifestyle. There's an egg and a pupa and a chrysalis, and then so it's quite common for organizations, for I work with organizations that they're unincorporated. It's getting a bit risky. They need to employ one, so they just set up a company to get that simple limited liability. Then they want to do something like a community share offer. So they've converted it into a community benefit society, which is able to do a public share offer, which none of the others are. And so they've actually gone through 3 stages in their life cycle. So you can interconvert these things and change over time. Yeah, I've just seen a comment from Erica. Happy for my email to be shared and have conversations around your individual circumstances out of this meeting. That's fine. Check. Oh, there was one other thing you wanted to talk about, which was the how do organizations operate internally. Yeah, so I'll just share my screen again, but this is the one that kicked me out last time, so bear with me. So it's back to that Miro board with the bubbles on. If it even lets me. So there we go. So coming over here, so from that one there, looking at this in a bit, how do they operate into? So this is that basically, you've got members, they elect a board, but then you often talked about things, oh, we've got people on Facebook, or we've got people who just sign up to a newsletter. We sometimes think of those as associates. So that people have a relationship with the organization, but they don't get involved in the governance in it. So the idea is these people in this circle here have power, control, they ultimately own the organization. If they're the same as this board, then it's a collective, but as they get big, they often elect a different one. And then scooting across here, ignore all of this. This would be a typical organization, say, a shareholder-based organization. They have members, which are shareholders, or this might even be something like the National Trust. They elect a board or a board of trustees in the National Trust. That board of trustees has a relationship with the chief executive, who then has a traditional hierarchy in any organization of departments amongst them. So even some cooperatives run this way. So there's so Co-op Group runs this way. It has members that elect a board. There is a chief executive, and then all the people who work in the co-op are underneath there. And in terms of how many organizations that I work with organize, and subcommittees were mentioned earlier on, and this is based directly on a system of organizational governance called sociocracy that many organizations that I'm working with are using now, and many transition groups are looking at. So you've got members, they elect a board, but now rather than a CEO, you've actually got an organizing circle there that can have subcommittees, and also the board itself can have subcommittees as well. But the idea is that each of these circles has a degree of autonomy. It's a way of spreading power through the organization. So for instance, the projects group, they might be working on one particular, they've got a budget, they know what decisions they can make, and they know when there's a boundary, when they have to kick it up to the circle above, So this is actually exactly the same as that corporate structure, but you're just replacing that one single point of contact with a central circle here, which is made up of representatives from all the different organizational structures within the organization, like HR, marketing, projects, etc. They put people into this circle, and also the board. And people often call the board the mission circle. They put people in. The idea being that if you go back to that ship metaphor, these are still the people on the bridge doing the high level stuff. Are we on course? Are there any icebergs? These are the people coordinating the day-to-day running of the organization. But of course, when you're small, these two circles are going to merge, because you basically haven't got enough people to have that amount of meetings. So again, I'm going to stop the share. I may disappear. No, it's let me back this time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Just checking in now with everybody to see whether or not there are any specific questions that you'd like Mark or Ros to answer before we close. Anything has come up for anybody? Now's the time. It looks like we've covered most of people's questions. Oh, go for it, Margaret.
Just wondered, Mark, we've been through the informal structure. We tried a CIC, and I won't bore you with the details of why I don't think it was successful. So we're now back at the informal structure. But what I'm interested in is if we were in the future to do anything, I'm happy as things are at the minute, but do you have any books on how to set up a cooperative that you'd recommend?
Yeah, so I dropped in the guide to for the transition that I did called the Duocracy Handbook.
Right.
So that's in the chat. There are so there is a guide that's just about legal structures, which is called Simply Legal, which is produced by Cooperatives UK. And that just explains all the legal structures in more detail. If what you're creating looks to be a cooperative, there are lots of resources on Cooperatives UK's website. But in terms of just going from that unincorporated group to and what you should go to, Duocracy Handbook pretty much covers it. Although it's a little bit out of date, and I email Rob Hopkins now and then saying, shall we update it? But I'm not getting anything back. So if any of you got Rob's ear more than I have, then yeah, feel free to tune in.
Mark. I've dropped that Simply Legal link in the chat there. So hopefully, Margaret, you'll be able to follow that and find it. Yeah, Rob is no longer an employee of the Transition Network. I think he's off writing a book somewhere. So that might have something to do with why he's not getting back to you. But I will pass on the message nonetheless. It sounds like an important task at hand. Right. Margaret, yeah, that it's really interesting to hear about your journey. The fact that you did go for that CIC incorporation, and then you as a group have stepped back away from that. I imagine that might have been the end for quite a lot of groups, and somehow you've managed to survive. With the minute or so that we have left, have you got any kind of advice for the resilience, for building that resilience within a transition group, in terms of navigating tricky governance? Because it'd be lovely to hear.
I think our main problem really was that we didn't have a reliable treasurer for most of the time. So, and also I think we didn't spend enough time building trust, which I know was a key theme early on. And also people move on. So 2 people moved from the area. And I realized that it was taking up an increasing amount of my time filling all the gaps, when what we really needed to do post-COVID was to re-establish what we had before. And so that's how come we did that. I think too, and then we're gradually building a new core group, along transition principles, but it's still in the early days. But we are doing stuff, we've got regular meetings and there's a lot going on. So we weren't starting from square one.
Fantastic. Yeah, often those projects are what keep people together. And going back to what sounds like a really wise move considering your situation. So thank you for that share. Just coming back to the speakers, we've got a minute left. Ros, do you have any final reflections that you'd like to share with us this evening? It'd be lovely just to hear a kind of a final word or two from you before passing back to Mark.
Not really. I think that was very useful, hearing where other people are at and hearing what you've got to say, Mark. I'm definitely going to have a look at what you just recommended from the Reconomy project. That sounds really useful. Yes, it's strange for us because, as I said before, we've always been reactive. And I think I'm feeling a bit nervous about that, having been reactive for about 15 years. If we do want to scale up and expand, I think having the information ready for if we do have to change our structure is going to be really important to us. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ros. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, I mean, I sort of got a livelihood in the space because the landscape is very complicated. But normally, as soon as I'm made to group, I know what the most appropriate legal form is, but I actually go through a process with them, and I have quite a nice interactive online sort of where we move things around and we prioritize all these different things. Or if we're face to face, we do it with post-it notes, and we end up choosing the most appropriate legal structure for them. And groups often get stuck at it. But I think in terms of just incorporation, it comes back to that you're fine doing what you're doing until there is significant risk to the members, or you need to do something like community share offer. So if you need to own an asset, you're doing significant trade, you need to enter into a contract, including an employment contract, then you need to incorporate. And then exactly what you want to do and how you want to run it, and particularly the finance you want to raise, will determine what the most appropriate legal form, and there's support available for you to do that as well. And I'm just finally going to drop in, I also wrote a thing for the Reconomy project called the Transition Enterprise Handbook, which has got similar stuff in there, and there's an online flip book of it there, which that link goes to. Check.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Ros. And thanks to Pauline as well, who contributed, and everyone for joining this evening. And for those of you who are watching back via YouTube, really hope that this has been informative and interesting for you. It certainly has been for me. And just to say that in the chat, I've just dropped some links. So we've got our events page where you can find out all about our future events coming up. There's a Transition Together newsletter, which is packed full of goodies. Definitely subscribe to that if you haven't already. And also join Vive, our online community where transition groups and transitioners meet and share ideas and support each other and the post opportunities. And it's becoming a really thriving space, a really fantastic bubbling community, very, very supportive. Definitely get on there. It's really easy to use and advert free as well. Thanks for all of your advice, Mark, and your insight into all of those structures. It's brilliant that you've been so generous and opening sharing your email and enabling people to get in contact with you. If you want to get in contact with us, there's our website and our Twitter and our Facebook and Instagram one more time. To close, it'd be wonderful if you could just each of you drop a word or a sentence for your experience this evening, just something to give us some feedback to let us know how we're doing. Did it hit the mark? Did it get everything done that you needed to get done? Would you like to see something else? Let us know. One word answers are great as well, and we'll read them out as we go. So if you wouldn't mind just popping those in the chat now. So we've got really thorough, succinct, personal, thank you, agile, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's been a really, really great way actually to spend an hour and a half. Food for thought from Ros, thank you. And on an evening which is hot and sweaty and there's lots of other stuff going on, we're really, really grateful for everyone for coming tonight. So have a good rest of the evening, everybody, and hopefully see you at future Skillshares. Next month, Skillshare has been postponed because we're going to do a post-election special. And news of that will be coming out very, very shortly. So stay tuned for that. It's how we can really build that positive movement forward based on whatever the election result will end up being. If you'd like to unmute and say goodbye, that's all we have time for. Take care, everybody. Go well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
So much.
Bye.